A few years ago, my father was diagnosed with advanced cancer, and I almost didn't even hear about it until it was too late. By too late, I mean just 1 week before his surgery. I was incredibly stressed and worried, but told myself that at least this surgery was going to be in one of the most prestigious medical institutions in all of America. I'm not going to tell you the name of the hospital, but you can get the idea. State of the art, the kind of place you're supposed to trust without a second thought. So imagine my shock and confusion when we went to the pre-op appointment with my father to meet the urologist, one of the most senior, by the way, at this medical center. And it became clear pretty quickly that the doctor didn't seem to know very much about my father's very high-risk medical conditions. Here was my dad, about to undergo a lengthy, complex, dangerous procedure. And the doctor didn't seem to know or mention anything about his lifelong history of multiple heart attacks and diagnosis of heart failure, nor did he seem to know anything about his very high bleeding risk. Two pretty important things to know before you're going to cut into someone, no? Instead, the surgeon repeatedly said the cancer looks really advanced, that urgent surgery is his only option, and in his opinion, he didn't think my dad's prognosis or survival looked very good. I was in shock, so was my dad, but we responded to that news in very different ways. My dad went out immediately and made some pretty questionable decisions about his life savings. I know what you're thinking. What kind of questionable decisions? I mean, how bad could they be? Let me put it this way. They were not the kind of decisions he would make if he didn't think the end was near. They were pretty bad decisions. But it was a typical reaction. He did what most people do when they hear some devastating news. They panic, they don't ask questions or consult with others, and they may even accept the fact that they're going to die without putting up a fight. As a medical doctor who's had to be an advocate for a number of family members with cancer and a lot of other life-threatening diagnoses, I have personal experience receiving a shattering diagnosis and delivering them. As a doctor, I've seen patients shut down and go into a state of acceptance or sometimes denial that neither serves their best interests nor prolongs their life. And in fact, studies show that in light of hearing a cancer diagnosis, up to 50% of patients can go into some degree of denial, with men, elderly patients, and those with a different cultural background, people just like my dad, having even higher rates than that. That response is rooted in the way that our brain functions. When we hear any kind of devastating news or when we sense that we're in danger, it's our limbic brain that's activated. The limbic brain is the oldest, most primitive part of our brain, and it governs emotional responses like anger, fear, rage, and sets off our fight or flight responses. It is the limbic brain that tells you not to touch a hot stove or to step back from the edge of the cliff if you're too close. And it's that same exact system that's activated anytime we hear any kind of terrible news. And the problem is when this primitive brain kicks in, it has the ability to diminish and impair our more logical prefrontal cortex, leading us to panic and freeze and making it more likely for us to make irrational choices. We simply stop thinking logically. I certainly know what that feels like. I moved to the United States when I was just 9 years old. After the trauma of living in a country at war and overcoming the challenges that a young girl from the Middle East deals with growing up in the Midwest, that was as tough as it sounds. My family and I experienced more medical misdiagnoses and treatment errors than anyone should have to go through. I got to a point that it seemed like I was getting negative news pretty frequently, especially bad medical news, and where it seemed like someone in the family was always trying to die on me. especially my dad, on multiple occasions. Later, as I went through my medical training, I learned that when a patient receives a life-threatening diagnosis, effective rapid response is of decisive importance. I know it's not enough to eventually make good decisions when time is of the essence. And it's those very experiences that taught me the importance of asking a lot of questions. So while my dad was out making crazy investments, I decided to do the opposite. I started doing a little bit of digging and asking questions and found another doctor for second medical opinion. Another doctor in that same prestigious medical center. This second doctor was not only kind and compassionate, but very well informed about all of my father's high-risk conditions. And actually, with his help, he was able to refer us to an excellent heart doctor who was able to make some critical medication changes to reduce his risk in preparation for this big surgery. On the day of surgery, we were all in tears, and we said our goodbyes, thinking that there was probably a pretty high chance that he wouldn't even survive this procedure. The doctors told us that it might be a lengthy procedure, so we kind of prepared ourselves. I was still in tears 15 minutes later when the doctor called me. He was calling to tell me the procedure had ended. And what was thought to be advanced cancer actually turned out to be a benign, non-cancerous growth of insignificant consequence. Can you imagine that? I can't tell you the flood of emotions that came over me at that moment. But in the very least, I was pretty happy that I decided to get the second opinion that led us to this wonderful doctor. And in fact, a study in April of 2021 shows that getting a second medical opinion reduces the chance of misdiagnosis in half, and is one of the most effective steps that can reduce diagnostic errors. Yet, despite this growing body of evidence, a fraction, according to studies, maybe somewhere around 5 to 35% of patients actually seek out a second medical opinion. That's simply the result of patients accepting what they're told in the moment, maybe not wanting to ask too many questions, or maybe being worried what that first doctor is going to think if they seek out a second opinion. That, I think, is a big mistake. We need to do the opposite when we hear any kind of bad news and counter the panic of the limbic brain by activating our prefrontal cortex that seeks alternatives, maybe questions authority, and helps us with those higher level decisions. When we do that, we gain ownership of the situation and put ourselves in the driver's seat. I want to leave you with a few steps whenever you hear any kind of bad news. Maybe the news is a cancer diagnosis, maybe it's financial disaster, maybe it's a divorce. No matter what the news, your response to it and your ability to recover from it are going to be much improved if you gain ownership of the situation. So step one, and this is something we can do now before we hear some kind of terrible news. You have to understand that we have to be mindful of limiting our constant and excessive exposure to negative news, because it can just put us in that vicious limbic loop that puts us in constant survival mode. I know that's been really difficult to do the last few years, but we have to do it to protect our mental health. Instead, by surrounding ourselves with supportive family and friends, hopefully ones that can get us out of that limbic hijack, or considering practicing gratitude or mind-body skills, we can really train and prepare our nervous system and our prefrontal cortex to have much healthier responses when that inevitable day comes that we're going to hear some kind of terrible news. Step two, this is after hearing the news, reassess. Take some time to process the information you've been given. Understand the flood of emotions, the panic, the fear. That is your limbic brain, the primitive brain, screaming at you. It's impossible not to hear, but you don't have to listen to it, and you don't have to do what it's telling you to do. Step three, jumpstart your prefrontal cortex. Do your research. Get those second opinions. Heck, if you need to get a third opinion, good third opinion, and get comfortable asking a lot of questions. Step 4, most important, take control. Do what you can to empower yourself to move from crisis mode into problem-solving mode. Speak up and never give up. I also want to leave you with a call to action, and that is to ask who in your life may need to hear this. Maybe it's you, but if it's not, ask yourself, who needs to put this into practice? Maybe it's a neighbor, a colleague, a friend, someone dealing with devastating news. Find a way to be a resource to them and help them see the flaws that may exist within their own decision-making process. And most importantly, and I say this as a daughter and a doctor, know that all of these challenging situations have taught me that there's no situation so dire that it can't be improved in some way. Even in the seemingly most terminal cases, life can be extended by weeks, months, and sometimes years, as I have witnessed myself. That, to me, is what hope looks like in action. Find it in yourself and help others to do the same. Thank you.